And here we are with the Plaid Avengers World by John Boyer in his chapter on developed or developing. And remember, you're following along with the questions that I've put on each slide, and I am giving you pieces of his text that will help you answer the questions. Okay. Stinkin' rich places, dirt poor places. Some states are really well off and a whole lot more are struggling day to day to make ends meet. Why are some countries or regions rich and others poor? As this manual has pointed out, it is not simply a matter of size of the country or the resources it contains. Reality, as always, is much more complicated than that. Before we can even identify traits of these developmental differences around the globe, we should first sort out some basic definitions and terms. Have you ever wondered if there is a third world, where are worlds 1 and 2? In order to understand these crazy catchphrases, let's start with a close-up of some other common conundrums. These words and descriptors are often tossed around to describe the state of states, that is, how well off they are, or inversely, how close to being in the global gutter they are. A developed country is one that we would consider first and foremost rich. Most text, news articles, and smart people somehow forget to speak the plain darn truth and call a spade a spade. They will describe lots of different variables that account for how a state is rich without ever outright just saying it. The developed countries are the rich ones. Admit it. Have you heard of a fully developed country that's flat broke? I suppose it's possible, but I've not been to one yet. Developed also carries the connotation that these countries are matured at the end of the cycle and therefore stable. I think that's a very good way to put it. But what cycle are we talking about? We'll get to that in a bit. You might also hear developed countries called industrialized countries, more economically developed countries, or fully developed countries, or even the first world. A developing country, on the other hand, is perhaps not so rich. However, it may not necessarily be totally poor either, which could be indicated by such measures as GDP and GDP per capita. Most of the planet would be in this category, both numbers of states as well as numbers of people, and as such, there is a tremendous range in the spectrum of developingness. Some states are close to being fully developed, some are desperately poor and stagnant or not really developing at all. Perhaps developing countries are best described as all the regions that are obviously not fully developed. Is that a nebulous enough description? Yes, but it kind of works. The operative word here is developing, which means that these countries are in transition, are changing, are developing into something newer, better, and richer. No state is actively trying to undevelop, are they? Synonyms for developing countries include less developed countries, least economically developed countries, underdeveloped countries, undeveloped nations, and the most popular term that everyone recognizes, the third world. The third world. What a hilarious term. Everyone recognizes and uses it, but no one knows what it really means. And it really doesn't mean anything anymore. Here's the real deal. During the Cold War, there were two opposing camps. Team 1 was the capitalist democracies led by the US, aka the West. Team 2 was the communist countries led by the USSR, aka the Soviet bloc. They became known respectively as the First World and the Second World. All the other countries were encouraged to join one of these teams, and many did, or at least would allow themselves to be associated with Team 1 or Team 2. However, there was a group of holdouts who refused to side up. They wanted nothing to do with the Cold War nonsense and identified themselves as non-aligned. India, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Yugoslavia led this non-aligned movement, NAM. I point them out by name because their status then, as now, has a lot to do with how the term the Third World evolved. Many other similar states joined this movement, and as you might imagine, their poor, less developed economies became an identifying mark, a mark that still sticks today. There is no more Cold War, and there are no more First and Second Worlds, but somehow the Third World is still out there batting. Can someone please tell them the game is over? But seriously, why was it that these countries were so much poorer than the First and Second Worlds at the time? And why have some of them not changed much since the Cold War era, which is why the third world terminology has stuck. Ah, I'm so glad you asked. To understand today's world of development, we must travel back in time just for a bit and pick up a theory we introduced at the end of the last chapter. A pithy history of the periphery. Think back to that Immanuel Wallerstein stuff I threw at you in chapter 4. Remember the world systems approach I alluded to? It was that set of mechanisms which redistributes wealth from the economic periphery to the core. Time to dust it off and take a second look through a historical lens so that we can more clearly see why places like India and Vietnam and Brazil came to be on the peripheral edges of the world economy prior to the Cold War, as well as how the US and Europe were at the core. In doing so, we can also elaborate on why these descriptions have persisted into the modern era, along with some examples of major changes which are currently underfoot. Ha, Watson, the game is afoot, and Sherlock Holmes' Britain is a great place to start the investigation. Just take a minute to look at the map and notice where the core and the periphery are located, as well as the semi-periphery, which means that their economies are somewhere in the middle between the established core, which in many cases is the industrialized West for the most part, and then the periphery, your so-called third world, possibly, and then the semi-periphery, which means that those countries are making perhaps greater improvements than what's still located at the periphery. The colonial period. In terms of world history, the 1500s to the early years of the 1900s are really a European heyday. Prior to this age, neither European states individually nor the region as a whole made a significant impact on the rest of planet Earth. They certainly were not anywhere near the core of a global economy, nor a center of political power, nor a center of technical innovation. You would have had to go to India or China or the Middle East to get those things. Why? Because Europe was a backwater, the US was as of yet undiscovered, and Japan was a samurai-infested, isolated state. But what a difference a few hundred years makes. As the 1500s and 1600s unfolded, European traders, scientists, businessmen, sailors, and military men all increasingly adopted and refined technologies from other societies, namely Arab sailing technologies from the Middle East and gunpowder from the Chinese. As a major case in point, the Chinese had invented explosive powder and employed it for, ready for this, fireworks. The Europeans borrowed this explosive powder stuff from China and they make guns. I think you may be starting to see how the core periphery tide was starting to turn already, but I digress. The Europeans take their newly modified and improved technologies and build grand navies and militaries, which inevitably make them masters of the seas, both militarily and for trade. And with that mastery came colonization and imperial takeover. You know, the Europeans setting sail and taking over the rest of the planet. North America, South America, Australia, and eventually Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, even parts of China, etc., come under the direct control and exploitation of the Europeans. Raw resource wealth, wealth from any existing manufacturing, along with wealth created by trade itself, now flowed from the colonized areas back to Europe. Europe is quickly becoming the core. Then, starting in the 1700s, the Europeans are the first to undergo this whole process we now call industrialization, making machines to do stuff that humans and animals used to do, and doing it better, faster, cheaper. Virtually all aspects of agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and transportation are made way more productive and profitable. And this also means that Europe is now the center of innovation and the technology leader, which of course makes them richer still. Europe sustains this revolution by fully mastering trade relationships around the globe, absorbing the raw resources of the planet, taking them back home to be processed, thus creating jobs and wealth at home, and then pushing their manufactured goods to their colonies. Example: United Kingdom forces India to stop producing cloth by insisting that they instead sell the UK all their cotton. The UK takes the cheap cotton back to the textile mills in London, produces it into cloth, and then sells the finished goods back to India at a higher price, of course. Buy low, sell high. Europe is now the core, and India has become part of the periphery. It is important to note that China undergoes a similar devolution at this time, having their core status severely eroded by European, Russian, and even Japanese trade dominance during the 1800s, culminating in the catastrophic 1839 Opium Wars, in which the United Kingdom totally dismantled Chinese authority altogether in their bid to forcibly sell opium under the banner of free trade to China. Wow, put that in your pipe and smoke it, China. And they did. Please keep in mind, in this scenario, Europe's strong naval presence is perhaps more significant in its successful of over takeover of over global trade systems than it is for its takeover of physical territory itself. Because inevitably, they will lose those colonies, but the trade dominance remains for some time after that. Here is an equation to consider. Dominating world trade creates wealth at home equals more taxes collected by government equals stronger government equals government invests more back into technology, infrastructure, military, and business equals stronger military and businesses equals more power abroad to colonize and control trade equals more wealth equals go back and repeat equation. Repeat for centuries. Not bad for a few hundred years' work by folks who previously were groveling in the mud waiting for King Arthur to find the Grail. But changes are coming. Into the modern era. Of course, the good old days don't last for the Europeans forever. Independence movements worldwide were kicked off by the American Revolution in 1776, but they didn't happen all at once. It took from 1800 right up to the 1960s for those European imperialists to lose control of their overseas possessions, with many African states the last to shake off the colonial hangover. These movements coincide with the abolition of slavery and serfdom worldwide and thus the end of free labor, which also put a crimp in the European wealth-generating machine. In addition, some former colonies and others learned the lessons of European history very well, and then duplicated them. The U.S. in particular underwent its own industrial revolution and rise to global power, and thus entered the core arena itself by the 1900s. Russia and Japan modernized as well, and quickly became core players too, albeit on rockier paths that we will investigate further in later chapters. Australia and Canada followed suit. Point is, the core expanded to include others now in competition with the European masters, and the periphery became even weaker as these new global power players had more economic strength than even imaginable in the past. But hang on, do not interpret this as the end of European economic dominance, because as I suggested above, the trade patterns had been well established for hundreds of years, and they proved to be a much more tenacious beast than simple ownership or control of colonies. Colonial labor may not have been free anymore, but let's face it, former colony labor remained extremely cheap as it does in today's world. Basic manufacturing has shifted from the core to the periphery in order to take advantage of this cheap labor, but the profit margins still go to the core, same as it ever was. In addition, while the UK or France or Spain may have officially left the colony of India or Algeria or Chile, they usually left behind multinational corporations under their sponsorship which still controlled and or profited from the raw resource of the former colony. This is a situation that is still common today. Almost all of the biggest and richest multinational companies of the world originate in Europe or the US and operate with huge competitive advantage in the poorer parts of the planet. You know, the periphery. Local yokel companies in Africa or Asia can't possibly compete with the likes of Walmart or Exxon. Core wins. End result. Core countries still import cheap raw resources from the periphery and produce high value commodities which then export to the periphery. Core wins. Quite frankly, the equation has not changed much and neither have the goods traded. The periphery exports cotton, tea, bananas, oil, and imports finished goods. The core imports raw stuff and basic manufactures and exports guns, machines, finished goods, etc. Same as it ever was. Let's be brutally honest here. The rich core countries have absolutely no vested interest in changing the system. Why would they? No government or business is going to actively try to change the rules of the game that ensure their own victory. So is economic history finished? Is the system now set forever? Ha! Nothing stays the same forever, and even in the most structured system, escape is possible. Escape is possible.